The marble floors of imperial Rome gleam under torchlight, slick with spilled wine and sweat. Musicians play trembling notes, their eyes fixed on the ground, terrified to look upon the emperor. Draped in silk and dripping gold, Gaius Caesar, remembered by history as Caligula, reclines on a couch like a god descending into madness. Around him, senators, soldiers, and slaves are forced into spectacles of flesh. To resist is death, to submit is humiliation beyond imagination. The myth of Rome tells us of grandeur, of Caesars crowned with laurel, of triumphs etched in stone, of an empire born of order and discipline. But behind the marble statues and heroic busts was another Rome, a Rome where one man's desires became law, where cruelty was ritual, and where sexual terror replaced governance. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years. Yet in that brief time, he turned the Roman court into a theater of horror, dissolving the line between intimacy and punishment, between pleasure and execution. What the poets and senators dared not write openly has survived in whispers, fragments of testimony that expose an emperor who weaponized sexuality itself, using it not for passion, but for domination, degradation, and control. Tonight we strip away the myths of imperial majesty to reveal the Rome of Caligula, a Rome of forced encounters, broken bodies, and the emperor who sought to become both god and monster through the most terrifying sexual practices of his age. The boy walked among soldiers before he ever learned what it meant to be a child. Iron helmets glimmered like a forest of steel above his head. Boots crushed gravel in rhythm, and the stench of leather, sweat, and blood was the perfume of his cradle. He was Gaius Caesar, though the men named him Caligula, Little Boots, because he marched in miniature armor beside them, a mascot of war. To the legions he was a symbol, a charm against defeat. To himself he was already something stranger, both adored and objectified, worshipped and laughed at. The camp was no playground. Every tent whispered of discipline, carved into flesh, whips cracked against disobedient backs. Prisoners were nailed upright as warnings, their mouths slack with flies. The boy watched these things not as stories told later, but as daily lessons. He saw the way men flinched before authority, the way rank alone made cruelty acceptable. Power was not simply force, it was spectacle. It was humiliation. Even in his earliest years, he learned that the body could be reshaped by fear more quickly than by love. But the darker lessons were not confined to the battlefield. When Caligula's father, Germanicus, died under suspicious circumstances, the boy watched his mother, Agrippina, crumble into grief and fury. One by one, relatives fell to treachery and political murder. His brothers were starved to death in exile. His mother beaten, banished, erased. He was too young to intervene, too powerless to do more than watch as the people who carried his blood were broken under imperial suspicion. For a child, there are few cruelties sharper than witnessing a parent stripped of dignity. He saw his proud mother forced to silence, her once commanding voice dwindling to whispers. He saw her hair cut away in disgrace, her body wasted, her name dissolved in official edicts. To young Gaius, the lesson was carved in fire. Love could be stolen, kinship violated, safety dissolved in an instant. Powerlessness gnawed at him like an invisible rat. And yet, among the soldiers, he was still cherished. They lifted him onto their shoulders, cheering their mascot of Rome, laughing as he paraded in his tiny armor. But beneath the laughter was something colder. Even adoration could be a performance. He was not loved for himself, but for the symbol he carried, the illusion of innocence in a world where innocence did not survive. Imagine being told from your earliest breath that you are both adored and disposable, sacred and expendable. The child learned that loyalty could be bought with spectacle, but never trusted. He learned that those who smiled today might denounce you tomorrow. Above all, he learned that weakness was intolerable, for weakness was always punished. There were nights when the boy lay awake, listening to the distant screams of deserters flogged alive, their cries floating into the dark like ghostly lullabies. The soldiers' laughter around the fire, the creak of leather belts, the acrid smoke of charred meat, all mingled with the faint sobbing of his mother behind a tent wall. That mixture of cruelty and tenderness, adoration and terror, soaked into his bones. This was the soil in which Caligula grew, a childhood marinated in blood, betrayal and forced silence. What survives in a boy who learns early that affection can mask cruelty, that family can vanish overnight, that the body is nothing but clay for those who command? The answer would come years later, when the boy with little boots ascended a throne. What he had once endured in silence, he would repay in excess. The powerlessness of a child would become the obsession of a man who demanded that all others feel his fear, and Rome, unprepared for the transformation, would be dragged into the theater of his private nightmares. The city exhaled as if waking from a long suffocation. Bells rang, torches flared, and the crowd surged through narrow streets with a hunger that bordered on worship. The boy who had once been a mascot in soldiers' boots now wore the laurel crown, and Rome greeted him with tears of relief. They believed the cruelty of past rulers had ended. They believed in renewal, in mercy, in a child of Germanicus restoring dignity to the empire. Hope itself filled the air like incense, thick and intoxicating. But hope was always a fragile flame, and flames can be smothered with a single breath. Within the marble walls of the palace, something colder stirred. Caligula did not see himself as a man elevated by chance or lineage. He saw himself as a being beyond flesh, a vessel of divinity. Where the senators saw politics, he saw theater. Where the people craved justice, he demanded reverence. He was no longer the powerless child who had watched his family erased. He was now the eraser, the hand of destiny itself. His reign began not with governance but with ritual. Statues of gods received new faces. His altars trembled with offerings in his name. He commanded temples to reflect his image, demanded prayers spoken as though to Jupiter himself, and those who had once bowed to unseen divinities now bowed to him in flesh, trembling as they kissed the hem of his robe. Rome was unprepared. Senators, once dignified in their solemn debate, now found themselves summoned like actors to a stage where the emperor's whims dictated the script. Noble women accustomed to quiet power within marble atriums now felt the weight of his gaze, as though stripped bare. His desires were not veiled behind ceremony. They became decrees, carried on the tongues of guards, whose armor rattled like chains. Every gesture of kindness was a prelude to demand. Every smile concealed the lash of humiliation. To be near him was to drown in contradiction. Awe at the radiance of his crown, fear of the sudden violence in his eyes. The people of Rome whispered blessings in daylight and trembled in silence at night. For the emperor they had longed for was no longer one of them. He had ascended beyond them, and in his ascension he dragged them into his own labyrinth. In this labyrinth, religion, politics, and flesh melted into one indistinguishable form. To worship the gods was to worship him. To obey the law was to obey his desire. To resist either was to court annihilation. Boundaries blurred until loyalty itself became a performance, and the body, noble or lowborn, was nothing more than an instrument for his stage. The empire that had conquered the known world now bent beneath the weight of one man's longing, and that longing was insatiable. Rome had expected a savior. What it received was a ruler who demanded not simply obedience but surrender, not simply service but intimacy, not simply reverence but the dissolution of self before his gaze. The city that had once been a republic of citizens became a court of trembling actors, chained not by iron but by desire, twisted into law. And in that chain, Rome would begin to suffocate again. Only this time, it was not war or famine that closed its throat. It was the breath of a man who called himself a god and made all others his worshippers, his captives, his prey. The palace fell into silence when he entered with her hand in his. Torches flickered against the walls, and the senators lowered their eyes, pretending not to see what had already been whispered in every corner of Rome. She was Drusilla, his sister, his mirror, his chosen companion, yet at his side she walked as something more than blood. The warmth of her skin, the softness of her presence was flaunted as though it were a crown. Rome had always understood family as sacred. Kingship was the foundation of order, the very thread that bound house to house, lineage to lineage. But in Caligula's world, nothing was sacred unless it served him. That bond, meant to protect, became his stage for desecration. To possess his sister was to possess the untouchable, to profane what even gods demanded remain unbroken. He paraded her before them all, making the whisper of incest into an unspoken law. If he chose to violate blood itself, then nothing was beyond his reach. For Drusilla, no escape remained. The palace was both sanctuary and cage. Her silence became ritual, her obedience a form of survival. Imagine the weight of being transformed from sister to consort, from family to symbol. Each glance from him carried command. Each moment alone with him erased another layer of self. She was not allowed to remain simply Drusilla. She was remade as the vessel of his divinity. When he raised her to the rank of goddess, it was not reverence, but possession disguised as sanctity. Statues rose in her likeness, her name invoked in prayers, her image carried like that of Venus herself. But beneath the marble and incense lay a truth everyone understood, yet no one dared to speak. That her divinity was not chosen by gods, but carved by a brother's desire and an emperor's cruelty. The senators looked on in silence, their mouths dry, their hearts knotted with rage and helplessness. They could not condemn him without condemning themselves, for their silence was complicity. Each time they bowed before Drusilla as though she were divine, they too desecrated the fabric of their city. What once held Rome together, the boundaries of kinship, the dignity of family, dissolved into theater. And all the while, Caligula watched their discomfort with a smile, savoring their revulsion as proof of his supremacy. For him, incest was not simply lust. It was domination sharpened into ritual. By taking his sister, he consumed what others believed untouchable, and by flaunting it, he crushed their sense of order. To share his bed with Drusilla was to demonstrate that he had risen above the laws of men and the decrees of the gods. It was to declare that his body was itself law, and that no one could escape it, not even those who shared his blood. But desire cannot stop where it begins. Once Drusilla was remade in his hands, the others followed. Sisters paraded, rumors spread, a family transformed into unwilling participants in his theater of cruelty. Their hair, their voices, their bodies became extensions of his will. No touch of theirs could remain innocent, no bond untainted. The warmth of family was turned cold, reduced to ritual humiliation. When Drusilla died young, whispers spread that the emperor wept not as a brother, but as a widower. He demanded she be worshipped as a goddess, her image carved among the immortals, her name spoken in prayer. Yet behind the marble offerings lingered the hollow echo of corruption. Her divinity was not a crown, but a tombstone, a permanent reminder of what had been violated. Rome recoiled, yet remained silent. Citizens mourned a woman they hardly knew, senators bowed to a goddess they did not believe in, and in the quiet of their homes, families wondered if their own sanctity would survive the reign of a man who had torn his own blood into spectacle. The violation was not only of kin, but of Rome itself. If incest could be enthroned, then nothing was sacred, nothing safe. In the emperor's hands, even the purest bonds could be twisted, desecrated, and displayed as proof of his limitless power. And in that silence, dread thickened. For if blood itself was no longer a sanctuary, what remained? The night began with velvet drapes drawn across marble walls, with silver platters heavy with roasted meats and wine that smelled of fire. Senators entered the hall with trembling smiles, wives adorned in silk that clung too closely, slaves scurrying with eyes lowered to the ground. The emperor reclined upon his couch, his expression unreadable, his voice soft enough that silence itself bent to listen. It was a banquet, they were told, a feast to honor Rome, to honor its noble blood. Yet each man who crossed the threshold felt the weight of dread pressed down on his chest. For here, celebration was only a mask, and beneath it waited humiliation sharpened to ritual. The first cups of wine brought laughter, the second loosened voices. But Caligula's gaze lingered not on the food, nor the music, but on the guests themselves. He observed them the way a lion observes prey, savoring their unease. And with a gesture of his hand, the games began. He called a senator forward, praised his loyalty, then summoned the man's wife into the circle of torchlight. The silence cracked as he ordered her to sit beside him. Her husband lowered his eyes, frozen between rage and terror. To resist was treason. To obey was to be unmade. One by one, women were chosen, their jewelry glinting like chains beneath the torchlight. They were kissed, touched, taken into chambers where laughter turned to muffled sobs, while their husbands sat powerless at the table. The emperor returned to the feast with their wives' perfume still clinging to him, smiling as though nothing had shifted. But everything had shifted. Men who once commanded armies, men whose words had shaped the fate of provinces, sat paralyzed, stripped of dignity by a silence they dared not break. This was not lust, it was degradation as entertainment. The feast became a theater of broken pride. Senators forced to watch their wives paraded like offerings, courtiers mocked until their laughter turned brittle, slaves compelled to perform acts that left the room thick with shame. To refuse was death. To obey was to become complicit in the annihilation of self. Each course of food, each goblet of wine, was another layer of cruelty, a reminder that their very lives were held at the whim of his pleasure. The torches burned lower, smoke staining the marble ceiling. Sweat and perfume mingled with the stench of fear. Some men tried to laugh, their voices hollow. Others swallowed their rage until their throats ached. Women returned to their seats pale and trembling, their eyes hollow, their dignity stripped away under the gaze of their peers. And still the emperor watched, not with desire but with amusement. For him, every tear, every averted eye, every forced smile was a victory greater than any battle Rome had won. Power, he had learned as a child, was not simply the right to command. Power was the ability to force another to destroy themselves while thanking you for the privilege. And here at his banquets, that lesson came to life. The empire itself sat at his table, devouring its own shame under his direction. By dawn, the tables were littered with bones and broken goblets, the floors sticky with spilled wine. Guests departed in silence, their sandals echoing like funeral drums through the corridors. No words were spoken, for to speak of what had transpired was to risk annihilation, yet each carried the memory carved into their flesh, into their pride. Rome's nobility had been undone not by sword or fire, but by obedience demanded in the form of humiliation. And in that silence, as the embers of the banquet cooled, one truth burned hotter than the torches. Nothing was sacred, no bond inviolable, no body beyond reach. The empire's rulers had been reduced, trembling actors, their dignity consumed like meat torn from bone. And Caligula, watching them unravel, had discovered a new weapon more devastating than war. The slow feast of degradation, where power was proven not by conquest of nations, but by conquest of souls. The palace on the Palatine hill was meant to be the beating heart of empire, a place where marble gleamed like captured sunlight, where statues of gods stood guard over the affairs of men. But under Caligula, its corridors changed. The air itself seemed different, heavy with perfume, cloying with heat, threaded with whispers too shameful to speak aloud. The home of emperors had become something else entirely, not a court, not a temple, but a brothel. It began with locked doors, velvet curtains, and a summons that could not be refused. Noble women found themselves escorted into chambers where silks lay not as garments, but as veils for a different kind of ritual. Men of high birth were dragged into rooms where obedience was the only language, their rank dissolving the moment the guards closed the door. Coins were demanded from visitors, as though the emperor wished to see senators, knights, even wealthy merchants reduced to customers in his house of humiliation. It was not enough to rule them, he had to strip them of their dignity, to turn their bodies into currency, their honor into parody. For the women, the violation was doubled. They were not merely compelled, they were displayed. The emperor himself chose who would serve, arranging Rome's nobility as though they were pieces in a grotesque play. Silk clung to trembling bodies, jewels pressed cold against damp skin, their beauty transformed from privilege into punishment. Some resisted in silence, their eyes refusing to meet his gaze. Others broke quickly, understanding that survival meant obedience, and obedience meant erasure of self. The men who entered these chambers as patrons carried shame just as heavy. To pay for what was once inviolate, to stand in line outside the doors of their own emperor's palace, was to feel their names dissolve on their tongues. A senator's title once echoing through the Senate hall meant nothing here. Here all were equal in degradation, their wealth reduced to tribute, their power to trembling silence. And always, Caligula watched. He delighted not in the act itself, but in the spectacle of undoing. The laughter that echoed through those rooms was not born of joy, but of cruelty. His cruelty sharpened into ritual. Every sob, every gasp, every silence confirmed his dominion over the very fabric of Rome. What better proof of godhood than to turn the empire's nobility into prostitutes and supplicants, forced to bow not before altars of Jupiter, but before the altar of his desire. The palace walls themselves seemed to absorb the echoes, laughter too loud, footsteps too hurried, whispers that would never be repeated beyond the marble gates. Outside, the city carried on. Senators still paraded through the forum. Citizens still hailed the emperor's name, but those who had entered the brothel of the Palatine walked differently afterward. Their eyes avoided one another's, their voices faltered when speaking of loyalty. They had seen Rome's dignity sold and mocked within its most sacred palace, and they bore the scars of it in silence. The brothel was more than humiliation. It was theater, it was ritual desecration. It was the emperor's way of declaring that nothing in Rome, not rank, not family, not virtue, could stand above his desire. And as the curtains closed each night, as the lamps burned down to smoke, the empire itself felt cheaper, more fragile, as though the gold of Rome had been melted into coins spent in the hands of its own ruler. The arena was already a place of blood. Rome had always gathered to watch flesh torn open, beasts released, gladiators reduced to silence in the sand. But under Caligula, the spectacle shifted. It was no longer death alone that satisfied him. It was the weaving of shame into the marrow of punishment, the transformation of cruelty into theater where the boundary between body and soul was erased before the eyes of the crowd. He would summon prisoners, men accused of treason, women condemned for defiance, slaves accused of nothing more than breathing too loudly in his presence. They were stripped of dignity before they were stripped of life. Their hair was cut away, their names unspoken, their identities dissolved in the roar of the crowd. What had once been human became an object, a canvas for his amusement. Some were forced into acts of humiliation before their execution, compelled to endure degradations as laughter echoed from the stands. Husbands made to watch their wives reduced to spectacle, fathers silenced as their daughters were displayed, noble blood mixed with the dust of the arena. These were not battles, they were rituals of erasure, staged to remind Rome that no rank, no bond, no purity could stand above his command. The emperor reclined as though upon a throne of gods, his expression serene, his voice soft as he gave orders that condemned flesh to suffering. He smiled not at the blood itself, but at the silence that followed, the silence of thousands watching, understanding that if such horror could be ordered for them, it could be ordered for anyone. It was not the sword that ruled Rome in those moments, but fear sharpened into performance. The air in the amphitheater thickened with heat, the smell of sweat, of dust, of iron. The cries of the condemned rose into the sky, torn apart by laughter, drowned in the sound of applause that had become obedience. And beneath it all was the deeper terror, the understanding that the emperor did not stage these scenes for justice, nor for vengeance, but for pleasure. Witnesses carried the images with them long after the sand was raked clean. The sight of noble women reduced to trembling captives, of men forced into shame before their throats were cut, of children watching parents undone beneath the gaze of their emperor. Rome was an empire of law, yet here law had become parody. The stage was no longer for gladiators or criminals. It was for anyone Caligula chose, anyone whose existence might serve as a reminder that even the most sacred body could be broken for entertainment. For those forced to watch, obedience turned into complicity. Every cheer, every bowed head, every silence became another link in the chain that bound them. To look away was dangerous. To protest was death. And so Rome applauded. Rome laughed. Rome gasped. And Rome died a little with every performance. This was the theater of cruelty, where punishment was no longer hidden in prisons or whispered behind palace walls, but displayed beneath the sun for all to witness. The empire was forced to feast upon its own degradation, and each performance left the city weaker, more hollow, more willing to obey. And in that hollow silence, Caligula's shadow grew longer, for if cruelty could become theater, then worship itself could become its chorus. What remained was not simply obedience, but the worship of fear itself, sanctified under the gaze of a man who claimed the name of God. The line between emperor and god had always been fragile in Rome, but under Caligula it dissolved completely. He no longer spoke as a man elevated by the Senate or by blood. He spoke as divinity incarnate, a living sun whose light demanded worship, whose gaze determined life and death. Temples that once echoed with hymns to Jupiter now resounded with prayers in his name. Statues of the gods were stripped of their faces, replaced with his own. Where Rome had once knelt before the unseen, it now bent before flesh, before one man's hunger disguised as eternity. He dressed in the robes of deities, parading through the streets adorned with jewels meant for sacred idols, his skin gleaming beneath the weight of borrowed holiness. At banquets he seated himself between gods carved in stone, demanding his guests bow as though they were at an altar. Those who hesitated felt the air tighten, their silence recorded, their loyalty questioned. Worship was no longer choice. It was compulsion pressed into every heartbeat, every whispered word. Yet his divinity was not celestial. It was carnal. His worship required bodies, not prayers. Women consecrated to gods were torn from sanctuaries to serve him. Men were summoned to prove devotion through humiliation. Sexuality itself became ritual, sacrifice in flesh rather than fire. To embrace him was to embrace survival. To refuse was to embrace death. Every touch he demanded carried the weight of sacred law, every violation declared as divine command. The people whispered of madness, yet they obeyed. For when a man declares himself a god, resistance becomes blasphemy, and blasphemy is punished more savagely than treason. Even in private chambers, whispers fell to silence, for walls themselves seemed to listen. Rome lived in dread, not only of the emperor's desire, but of the sanctity with which he cloaked it. To resist was not only rebellion, it was heresy. And so the empire bent lower. Senators bowed as priests, nobles trembled as supplicants. Families taught their children to mouth prayers in his name, knowing silence could betray them. The sun rose each day on a city no longer certain where heaven ended and Caligula began. But his godhood was never radiant. It was shadow disguised as light. The divinity he claimed consumed Rome's dignity. its laws, its very sense of reality. In his hands, religion became theater, desire became doctrine, and death itself became a form of worship. The city that once believed itself eternal now walked beneath a false sun, knowing that the same light that warmed could also burn, that the same man who demanded prayers could also demand their bodies, their silence, their lives. Rome was no longer merely ruled, it was consecrated to terror. And terror, when sanctified, leaves no refuge. It ended not in the blaze of ceremony, but in the hush of corridors slick with torchlight. The palace on the Palatine, once swollen with laughter and screams, trembled with a different kind of silence. Guards walked with faces carved from stone, their hands tight around spears, their eyes darting as though afraid that even the walls might hear. Somewhere deep inside the marble labyrinth, the emperor lingered, a man who had made himself a god, unaware that gods too could bleed. The conspirators gathered in shadows, men who had bowed, men who had feasted at his table, men who had clapped when his cruelty demanded applause. They were not innocent, but they were desperate. Their dignity had long since been devoured. What remained was survival. Each had tasted humiliation. Each had felt the weight of obedience rot their bones. And now their silence turned to resolve, their trembling into daggers sharpened against fear itself. Caligula entered the chamber, unaware. He carried himself as he always had, draped in silk, perfumed with oil, his gaze heavy with the certainty of divinity. He had mocked too many, taken too much, violated too deeply, and now the men who once called him Lord closed in with hands that shook, not from loyalty, but from terror of what they had become under his rule. The first blow was clumsy, a thrust born not of skill but of desperation. Then came another, and another. The emperor screamed, not the roar of a god, but the cry of a man, flesh pierced, breath stolen, voice broken into shards. His body collapsed against the marble he had once trod like a stage, the floor stained red where feasts had spilled wine before. The torches flickered, the air thick with iron, the silence shattered by the wet sound of steel in flesh. The man who had forced Rome to bow was reduced to trembling meat, his divinity stripped in an instant. The conspirators' faces twisted not with triumph, but with horror. For in killing him, they had killed more than a tyrant. They had revealed the fragility of power itself, the terrifying truth that fear can consume a city, yet still collapse in a single heartbeat. But his death was not clean. It was not catharsis. It was a stain, spreading outward from the marble floor into the hearts of those who watched, for what he had done to Rome could not be undone with blood. Families still carried the scars of humiliation. Wives still remembered the torchlit banquets of degradation. Senators still felt the shame of silence, the weight of complicity, the brothel, the feasts, the theater of cruelty. None of it vanished with his last breath. The echoes remained, and they would remain long after his body grew cold. Outside, the city carried on. Citizens moved through the streets, unaware in that moment that their emperor lay dying. Some would celebrate when the news spread. Some would weep. Some would whisper that justice had come. But justice was a fragile word in a city where silence had been worship, where fear had been sanctified. His assassination ended his body, but not the terror he had planted in the soil of Rome. Because Rome had witnessed what it meant for a man to erase boundaries, to claim godhood, to turn desire into law and cruelty into ritual. His death was not an ending. It was a mirror held up to the empire itself, an empire that had allowed one man to remake its soul. The marble floor dried, the stains scrubbed, the palace prepared for the next ruler. But those who had seen him, who had bowed, who had obeyed, carried him still. The empire could never cleanse itself fully of what had been done in those halls. The god had fallen, yet his shadow stretched beyond his grave, lingering in silence, reminding all of Rome that power, once unchained, could always return. And so his reign closed not with resolution, but with the dreadful stillness of memory. Blood on the marble, silence in the corridors. Rome left to wonder not if the nightmare was over, but when it might rise again.